And we've called this one Europe in Crisis, Reformation and Counter-Reformation. 4 sessions, 4 Tuesdays at 2 o'clock. The first session, the one that's beginning today, is a background session. I called it Europe in Transition, the social and intellectual backdrop to the Reformation. So it's going to be all sorts of topics leading up to Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses debate challenge on the door at Wittenberg, and which we'll go into next session. The second session itself, I've called, I thought I'd spring a little Latin on everyone, using the famous 3 solas of the Lutheran canon: sola fide, sola scriptura, sola gratia. Faith alone, scripture alone, grace alone. And we'll look at the central issues of the Reformation and the Revolution with a focus on, obviously, Martin Luther and John Calvin and some others, and the main issues they have with received Christianity in the 16th century. The third session, we're going to turn to the Roman Church and their reaction, the so-called Counter-Reformation. And I've called it a resurgent and defiant church. We'll look at the founding of the Jesuits and the Council of Trent, and a really change in spirit and style as a Reformed Catholic Church decides to get into it chin to chin with the Northern Protestants, the Northern European Protestants. And then the last session, which will be a very interesting one, we're going to look at monarchy and its challenge in civil war and outright war, with especially Reformed Protestants who have become very political and want to introduce Reformation ideas such as constitutionality into the political realm. And along with that, we're going to be looking very carefully at what I called here European dynamism, and particularly economic dynamism. This is the period of the great expansion of bourgeois capitalism, stemming from Northern and Western Europe, and its attempt to colonize the entire planet. And we could argue how successful that was. But I'm going to be using the great sociologist, the great German sociologist Max Weber's argument that Protestantism was very key to this expansion of capitalism and eventually industrialization. So with that, let's launch in. And so here we are. Initial slide, the demography and economy of Europe pre-1500. First of all, there's the map itself. And in the map, one of the reasons I chose this map is that it shows you how few were the places of concentrated population. Although it was heavily settled, Europe was essentially agrarian. And as you can see from these city ciphers on the left of the map, very few cities even made it to 100,000. Paris did, Rome did, Naples did. Really, London is only 50 to 100,000, I think. No, 25 to 50,000 at this point in time. So huge industrial centers were not the case. The highest area of population concentration was in northern Italy. In that blue box that I drew over the map, you'll see that I've highlighted the arena of Italian Renaissance city-states. They had the largest populations, they had the most advanced economies, which we'll be going into in a bit, and they were the area that developed the banking centers that became dominant into the 16th century, the period that we'll be negotiating in the class. Some comments about population. I've found fairly consensus population estimates for 50-year periods between 1300 and 1500 that I've listed in the upper right of the slide. And you'll notice where I can put my little highlighter spotlight on. Oop, I got the wrong one. Here we go. And you'll notice that population between 1300 at 79 million and 1350, 71 million, a significant decrease. What happens in the 1340s, 50s, 60s is the Black Death. And as I mentioned below, some estimates have anywhere from 25 to 35% of the entire population of Europe dying in this period, if you think COVID's a problem. And it had an incredible impact. It meant that for a very short period of time, things like wages actually increased because of the demand for labor. But there were other implications that we're going to address in a little bit that were dire for this period. But then you begin to see that by 1400, population begins to pick up again. By 1500, you're up to 90 million. And of course, you're almost at a takeoff point by the time we get to 1500. The voyages of exploration have taken place. Europeans are establishing trade routes, as I'll show in a slide in a minute, to Asia, to Africa, to North and South America. But in the period pre-1500, we're still in a world of tremendous subsistence agriculture. And subsistence agriculture largely means that you don't feed many more mouths than it takes to produce the food yield. So the profit, if you will, above subsistence is really minimal. When you see great 15th and 16th century palaces of the wealthy, and you know that this is on a marginal profit above subsistence, you realize how much money, in effect, had to be taken from everyone in the lower echelon of workers to sustain that kind of pinpoint wealth that you see. In a subsistence economy, there isn't a lot to go around. And I mentioned here that grain yields, 2-to-1 grain yields, are basically what you get for every grain that you plant. You develop 2 grains. Modern yields are 30-to-1. It gives you a sense of how unproductive the agriculture in this period still was, even though in the Middle Ages in Europe they had developed, there were breakthroughs like the heavy plow. They could dig more deeply into the ground. That's why you see ox teams pulling plows in medieval woodcuts that you would not have seen in Roman woodcuts all that much. The social organization of Europe was still largely feudalism, which meant that you had military and church aristocracies who controlled 95% of the land and could maintain rents and wages for the most part through their controls. The Black Death as I mentioned, between 1346 and 1400 allowed wages and social mobility to increase because there were places where populations fell so far in some urban areas that there were jobs to be had by moving to the towns. Uh, as a result of the chaos introduced by the Black Death, landowners tended to clamp down. They tended to infringe on the rights of their peasants, their serfs, if you will. And it's a period from 1380, 1450 or so when you would have a serious number of peasant uprisings, peasants who realize that as wages increase and there is an increase in the standard of living and prices of bread tend to go up, they are still being locked down onto the land. So there's this dance between an aristocracy, both a military and a church aristocracy. The military aristocracy, of course, are the knights, the barons who promise troops to their liege lords and control lands as fiefs in exchange, and the churchmen, the abbots and archbishops who controlled huge swaths of lands in Western Europe, in France, England, Spain, Italy, Germany. On to the next slide. Trade, to the degree that there was international trade in the European world, was largely Mediterranean based. So you see these trade routes coming out of the east through Persia and Turkestan, the Ottoman Empire, trade routes coming into Samarra and Damascus, ultimately headed for Constantinople to Cairo, and then put on boats, if they could make it to Crete, for instance, that were controlled by the Venetian Navy and the Genoa Navy. The Genoa had seaports in the Black Sea, Venice, all down the Venetian coast. In fact, you see this green patch of what we would now call Croatia, or what was formerly Yugoslavia, was in the control of Venice in this period. And they had good trade relations with the Ottomans and with the Greek Empire to the east. And they pretty well, as we discussed in the last class, which was on the Italian Renaissance, how they were able to build up in northern and central Italy great wealth, great art patronage as a result, because of the Mediterranean trade. And some of it could go through the Straits of Gibraltar and up to England, but the dominant controlling players were going to be Italian-based. And to the degree that northwestern France and Belgium and England developed, and they did develop in this period, pre-1500, it was because they had woolens to trade with the Venetians and with the Genoese and with other states in the Papal States of Central Italy, for instance. So Asian goods arrive in the Near East via the Silk Road, and the distribution and financing arranged in Venice, Genoa, and Florence. To the next slide. In the 16th century, and I put these two slides in immediate juxtaposition to emphasize the transition between 14th and 15th century trade on one hand and 16th century trade on the other. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. At the same time, the Portuguese were making it all the way to Indonesia, to India, to China. They would be joined by the Dutch and the English. The Spaniards were making it to the Americas. Uh, in fact, since the Portuguese and the Spaniards were fighting each other already over control of colonial trade from South America, they had to ask the Pope to step in to decide which corners of Latin America would be Spanish dominated and which corners would be Portuguese dominated. And so you wind up with Brazil, Portuguese speaking, versus everybody else in Latin America who's Spanish speaking. What happens, though, in the large scale is that the Italian Mediterranean-centric trade gets completely displaced by an Atlantic-based trade, and the center of gravity moves further west. And this is because it is much, much, much cheaper to bring the spices and silks and other trade items of value that were coming from China and India. It's cheaper to put them on boats and bring them around the Horn of Africa up to Western Europe, where they could go to England, where they could go to the Netherlands, where they could go to Portugal. And those places in England, in Portugal, in Holland, and in Spain, we're going to be doing a lot of highlighting later on in this course, in later sessions of this course. Just as in the Renaissance course, we were incredibly Italian-centric because that really was the center of the economic world at that time. As we move into the 16th century, of course, the Western European states inherit some of the grand developments of the Italian Renaissance, like banking. And so the shipping trade that develops between Asia and Europe is supported by bank loans and stock companies, which get invented in this period, in the period we're entering. The Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company will develop in this period. The first publicly traded company is the Dutch Shipping Company with the Far East. So Italian-centric trade is lost to the countries I mentioned. Colonies are established in the overland. Spice and silk routes are, if not entirely replaced, certainly culturally displaced. And as a result of this, the Western monarchies have much greater resources at their disposal. There is more money to be had through taxation and loans, not to mention the colonial import from the silver mines of the Americas. Spain produces a kind of currency inflation glut in the Europe of this period by importing so much specie, so much wealth from the Americas. And of course, later in the course, we are going to be addressing things like the development of colonialism, which will envelop and entail the foundation of the slave trade, which we don't have a lot of time to put into in our short sessions, but I'd like to do a class on it future point. Uh, Again, moving along, I mentioned these emerging monarchies. This is the period of the triumph of monarchy. This is the period of the establishment of the principle of divine right monarchy, particularly in Spain, in England, and in France. And the reason for this, people think that monarchs have always claimed authority by divine right. That's not the case. Perhaps the Holy Roman Emperor did, but the kings were feudal lords. The monarchs were just the highest liege lord in a feudal pyramid of lords and lords above them and lords above them. They were just the biggest dog in the kennel. It was only in this period that they began to assert a philosophical claim to lordship. And they were doing it at the expense of the aristocracy. In other words, in places like France, the King of France, who up through the late Middle Ages always had to contend with rival powers like the Duke of Burgundy, not to mention the King of England, who was also a Norman duke, but their dukes were virtually as powerful and in command of territories and armies that could rival the monarchs. The monarch was basically a first among equals. But in this period of increased economic wealth generated from cities who had economies based on trade and that were outside the domains of ducal controlled lands, the monarchs realized that they had natural allies in this new capitalist booming class. You see the big bullet on the right that I'll focus on in a second. The monarchs and the capitalists, the entrepreneurial classes of the emerging cities within their realms that always had a large bit of autonomy from the local aristocrats, the monarchs realized, and the entrepreneurial class realized, that they had natural allies in each other. On one hand, oh, you'll help pry us away from the claims that the local duke is trying to make on us in our city of woolen weavers or whatever we are. And you'll support us in our resistance to them, and we'll support you by allowing ourselves to get taxed directly by you and to make significant loans. Because this new imperial or monarchical, I bet is a better word, aggrandizement that you're undergoing is going to take great wealth. And I'm going to get to that point in detail in a second. Before I leave this top bullet, though, the triumph of the monarchies, there's one great exception. The Holy Roman Empire, not so much of an empire. It's a hodgepodge. It's a polyglot. It speaks half a dozen languages, at least maybe a dozen. It's controlled by the Habsburg princes from Spain, who've got claims in Holland and who control Bohemia, Hungary, directly through places like Vienna, Habsburg Vienna. But all these German states are controlled by small native princes and dukes who are quite independent of the emperor. In fact, the emperor is an elected, technically speaking, is an elected office. He's elected by the grand electors, the king of Saxony and several of the bishop princes within the empire. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of these small states. And it's this political hodgepodge that I'm going to suggest makes the Reformation, makes Martin Luther in particular possible. I'm getting ahead of ourselves, myself right now, but I want to plant the seed of the idea that it's because this is a barely controllable hodgepodge of states that have tremendous local independence. And each of the local princes is looking for any angle and wedge to keep themselves pried away from the direct control of the Habsburg Empire. Charles V, and we'll see what that develops into. So I've mentioned there's this capitalist boom. There's a new class of entrepreneurs and independent cities all through Central and Western Europe. Not nearly as much in Spain. Northern Spain a little bit, but basically it's the northern part of France, northern Italy, through the Germany, the several German-speaking areas, into up to the very edge of the Ottoman Empire, which you can see is leaning on Europe and is a threat in our period, and England and the English states. The why holy and why Roman? Somebody has asked. It was called Roman because the Emperor Charlemagne, as early as the year 800, was trying to rescue the mantle, although he was a German, a Frankish German. He was trying to rescue the mantle of the Western Roman Empire that had collapsed into disunity from the German invasions of his own people and Goths. And he was trying to claim that mantle of, we're going to be the Roman Empire restored. But since we're now Christian and Christianized, and we're going to take the blessing of the Pope on our effort to reinvigorate the Roman Empire, that we're going to call ourselves holy. So ever since 800, and now we are 700 years later, and they're still calling themselves holy, and they're still calling themselves Roman. And they have very little to do with Rome and very little to do with the church. But the Habsburg Empire at this point in time is still trying to make the claim 700 years later. Anyhow, we have this capitalist boom. Entrepreneurs, independent cities, booming up. If we saw a population concentration map in 1500, and then we saw another one, let's say by 1650, all of a sudden, it would look like, if you've ever seen aerial maps of Suffolk County in 1945, and then Suffolk County in 1970, when the hordes of New Yorkers made their way east on Long Island. That's what happened in Europe basically in the 16th and early 17th century. But talent, skills, and resources developed beyond the traditional centers. So whereas, let's say in 1400, when Coluccio Salutati was the chancellor of Florence, and the copyist skills and The banking talent was ready at hand in places like Florence, but certainly would not be found in places like Warsaw. Suddenly, in our period, it is going to be found. The printing press is out there. The Black Death has forced population movement at an aggressive pace. Uh, Price inflation from population increase, from importing silver and gold from the Americas, and higher rates mean that the owners of capitalist production, using Karl Marx's well-wrought phrase, that class is booming. They're going to have a boom time. And they're going to do it at the expense of the traditional nobility, which in the next bullet I highlight. And that nobility, the traditional nobility of the sword, the military, the ducal chain of liege lords, that nobility is going to be entirely under siege in our period. For one, the principle of the French historians use the term dérogeance, the loss of title for engaging in trade. They could not join the capitalists. They could take money bribes from cities in their realms to grant independent rights to those cities, freedom from certain tolls and things like that. However, they couldn't come in and say, a la the mafia of the 1930s in New York, and say, we want a piece of the business. They could not be Don Corleone because that would have meant losing, they would have had to give up their feudal roles, their feudal title to do that. And they were loath to do that. At the same point in time, as they're becoming economically less significant, their military role is almost completely displaced, replaced, abrogated, rendered null and void. Gunpowder has happened. And with gunpowder comes infantry. When you think of Cortez and his conquistador army in Mexico, you don't so much think of knights on horseback. You see foot soldiers with blunderbusses and cannon. This is the age of artillery. This is the age of infantry. This is going to be modern warfare until the tank is invented and air power is invented. The new military is going to be one that can be had in much greater numbers for much less money. Not less money in toto, because the King of France, the King of England, the King of Spain, they are now going to want to build armies of scales that were never anticipated in the medieval or Renaissance periods. When you had the armies of the hired gun condottieri in northern Italy, running around, Cesare Borgia selling himself to the highest bidder in papal state politics. You know, he could run around with an engaged army of some thousands, but he was not marshaling armies of 50, 70, 80,000, which were now affordable in one sense, in that a foot soldier with a blunderbuss is a lot cheaper than a knight who had to be with his entire supporting social network and support network and class. And but on the other hand, in toto, the support of such armies, and it was an arms race. Each of these new monarchs feeling their oats, feeling their potential expansiveness, wanted to flex the muscle a bit, build a large-scale army, and they had to do this with loans from the new wealthy banking class. And they had to perhaps get tax buy-ins from the cities who were happy to pay a certain amount of freight for even more independence. So it's also the era of market agriculture beginning to displace manorial agriculture. Medieval agriculture, the serf's produce went directly to the local lord, who would pass a cut of it onto his liege lord and up the chain. The lord of the manor got the greater part of the goods. Suddenly, there's a market in the cities to purchase directly from farmers. And so you have an increase in independent farming beginning to develop in places, with, of course, an emphasis on better agricultural techniques. This is the period in which people began to invent things like consolidation of the narrow strips of medieval land that used to get farmed very erratically because they couldn't plan for proper irrigation and the like. So, in self-defense, the aristocrats who control lands, including the monasteries that controlled lots of land, began to try to raise rents in self-defense, which produces a tremendous tension, social tension. They're getting squeezed. The aristocrats are getting just squeezed from every angle. Their rights are being subsumed by monarchs. Their tenants are becoming very resistant. The tenants that happen to be cities, they are in contention with for resources because the cities are beginning to buy the produce directly. So in this box in the lower left, something to keep in mind all through our period, because it's going to explain the reception that Martin Luther gets in certain corners of his world. There's a natural interdependence of monarchies and urban capitalists. Monarchs need taxes and loans to support the expanded state, and they get this at the expense of traditional aristocracies. Okay, and here we have the empire that is holy and the empire that is Roman. Okay, by 1500, the Holy Roman Empire essentially was the arena, the world that was German speaking. By and large, everybody in the German speaking world, there was no Germany, but all the people who used German as a primary language were the denizens of the Holy Roman Empire. By 1500, a world that has caught up to Northern Italy and Western Europe in economic development, especially in the lower tier, the Swiss Confederacy, Bavaria, Swabia, Austria. The reason you see, by the way, on this map, you see the word circle, is that by the middle of the 16th century, the tax collectors of the emperor would go, they would focus on one so-called circle at a time. We're now visiting the Austrian circle. We're doing our tour of the Bavarian circle alike. So it is a patchwork quilt of duchies, principalities. So there are dukes in some places, principalities, there are princes. Some of the places, in Switzerland, for instance, there are republics. There are bishoprics. There's places where the local bishop is the prince. There are people whose title is just elector because they get to elect the emperor. There are counties because they are ruled by counts. A count was a special emissary of the emperor in the court of Charlemagne. And there are some cities that are free in that they are directly under the emperor's private control. That whole patchwork is in one lump. The elected emperor, his power within this arena, not that he's not powerful, but it's limited in every local place because the local rulers have tremendous amounts of legal local control. There's no strong monarch in this region, as there is in France, as there is in England, who could, if you wanted to make the right kind of deal, protect the interests of peasants or the urban worker or the money classes. So you're going to, when Lutheranism establishes itself in the early period of the 16th century, it's going to have tremendous political ramifications. And that's why I'm trying to draw you to this backdrop. So it's a world that resents the Italian control of the church. This is all German speaking. It's got rich bishops, rich abbacies. They are all under Roman control, and a lot of the funding, because these are wealthy places, a lot of the funding of things like, as we will see in the next class, the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is paid for by the selling of indulgences in southern Germany, which makes Martin Luther want to have a baby, as we'll see. Anyhow, this part of the world becomes what I call down here the perfect stew for revolution. You have a lot of social unrest, you have weak central authority, and you have a lot of cultural resentment. So we are ready for it to happen. One final map, and because I'm not going to talk about the Ottomans a whole lot, but I wanted to establish early in your appraisal of what we'll be talking about, that the Ottoman Empire is here and is a power and is a major threat and regarded as a major threat to Europe. You see in this map, in fact, these are just all acquisitions by the Ottomans in different periods. By 1453, Constantinople has fallen, and it's entirely in Turkish control. Much of what we would now call Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, the Greek Peloponnese, the almost everything but the Croatian coast over here is under Turkish control. They have made peace with Christians in their own empire because this was the center of the Christian world in the ancient world. So we have, I've mentioned down in the third bullet under the Ottoman threat, the Devshirme. There's a child tax on Christians. So Albanians, Bosnians, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Serbs often have to contribute children to the court of the Ottomans to become the household janissaries. They're usually drawn from Christian households. And I believe that was the janissaries were essentially Christian in origin to keep other Muslims at bay in terms of bribing them. You could ensure their allegiance to the Sultan, much the way that the king of the two Sicilies in Palermo in the 13th century had his guard entirely comprised of Muslims because he didn't want the threat of papal excommunication to influence their devotion to his interests. Anyhow, the Holy Roman Empire is the buffer between the East, the Ottoman East, and the West. And indeed, the emperor in the 1550s, when we get into that period, Charles V, the greatest of the Habsburg emperors, is going to organize resistance. Oh, somebody asked the question, child tax is exactly what? It means that you must give up children. Each village has to give up. I'm going to stop this phone from ringing. There we go. That each village was taxed for a number of children. They, not in terms of money, give us 2 members of the household or 2 members of the village household kind of thing. It wasn't until 1571, well into our period, almost at the point that the Council of Trent closes into Counter-Reformation, that the Battle of Lepanto is fought by the Habsburgs, the Venetian Navy, elements from Spain, and there's a grand sea battle that puts aid to the Ottoman threat really for the whole modern period. They're still there, but they never rise to the threat of an invasion of, for instance, Vienna. In the early part of our period, when Luther, in Luther's lifetime, there's always the threat that Vienna is going to be invaded by the Turks from the east. So although the Habsburgs had their family roots in Spain, people like Ferdinand and Isabella, at this point, their major focus was on the eastern edge of their holdings and what we come to think of as Austria at this point in time. Anyhow, enough of the Ottoman Turks, little picture of the Sultan's court, and to the medieval papacy, some comments. So it was really in the 11th century that the papacy began to develop a kind of militant attitude towards what it considered threats to its aspirations really to control all of Western Europe. And the first way it used it was in calling the Crusades at the end of around the year 1100, 1095, 1096. And then all the way through the 12th century, there were Crusades. And the Crusades were largely against Islam at first. Invasions of Crusaders were sent to Palestine, to Jerusalem to try to retake the Holy Land. But they later were turned, in the 13th century particularly, to internal threats. So there was, for instance, in southern France and northern Spain, along the Pyrenees border, in the part of France that was at the time was called the Languedoc, after what we would call Provence now, but after the language in the Latin parts of the Mediterranean were referred to sometimes as by the way they said the word yes. So in Provence, the Languedoc, that's the language where "ok" is used to say yes, as opposed to Italy, which would have been the long C, or northern France, which would be the long oui. In the Languedoc, a group began to develop adherents, a group called Cathars, the pure ones. It was probably imported from near Constantinople. We know that there were groups of them, of Cathars in Bulgaria earlier on. And they preach a kind of hyper purist, quasi-Christian dualism that regarded the body as entirely evil. Some argue that they were influenced by Gnostic ideas from Egyptian Christianity in the ancient world. That may very well be true. But they took hold around the city of Albi and then under the European name, the Albigensians, the northern French king, using it as an excuse to begin to assert authority in southern France and basically to stamp out the independence of the Provençal dukes, which had strong ties through the Plantagenets to the King of England, sent an inquisition backed by an army, sent churchmen backed by the military to the south of France, where they introduced the French Inquisition, the Provençal Inquisition, the Albigensian Inquisition, which really created havoc in that part of the world and gave the church a model of being backed by temporal authority when it needed it that the papacy had never had before. Literally, we can send in our correctives to heretics and bring the temporal sword with us, bring the authority of troops along with us. And it's the first time that the Inquisition was used. And the Inquisition we're going to talk a lot about as we go forward. It's not the same in all periods, and it's not the same in all places. But the church was given an opportunity during this crusade against these heretics to test out its aggressive authority. Anyhow, early reform orders existed: Franciscans, Dominicans, Cistercians, which were a Benedictine offshoot, were aggressively co-opted by an aggressive papacy. So although St. Francis sets up the Franciscans on a model that would have gladdened Martin Luther's heart, its revolutionary qualities are quickly co-opted by a papacy who make sure that the Franciscan generals get appointed by them directly, and that what they begin to preach and how they begin to live is not too far removed from what the papacy finds culturally acceptable. There are groups called the spiritual Franciscans that are revolutionary, and they get pursued as heretics. And Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose, is really about that. So the papacy itself has direct temporal control of central Italy, the so-called papal states, the area of Rome all the way through the Marches, the Marche zone on the East Coast. So Lazio and the Marche and southern Tuscany and Umbria in modern zone divisions are controlled directly by the popes. And so the papal throne becomes the pawn. Have the Pope in your family becomes the pawn of the richest Italian families and families of European monarchs. So I just list the names of this, the family names of some of the popes in our period. Colonna, Borgia, Piccolomini, Della Rovere, Medici, Farnese. I mean, this is like a who's who of Italian and European wealth who get to control the papacy. And two of the most notorious of them, right from the beginning of the 16th century, Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, and Leo X, the Medici Pope, are among the more extreme abusers, if you will, of papal corruption. Control of wealth and patronage is what it becomes about, awarding bishoprics and abbeys and clerical appointments. When you appointed somebody the abbot of something, or appointed the bishop of something, you're basically making them the feudal lord of a tremendous amount of income. And so you gave it to a relative, or you gave it to somebody who was going to send you a kickback of an enormous order. When you get the grand tours of the Vatican now, it's in this period that wealth was being applied to the construction of the Vatican. You see this woodcut on the lower right of Alexander VI as this kind of a consuming beast with the Latin phrase up on top, ego sum papa, I am the Pope. By 1500, the papacy was widely, not just in Germany, but widely seen as decadent, corrupt, power-hungry, money-grabbing, and nepotistic. And it was just not seen as having spiritual and moral authority. So its control by Roman families was widely resented. They saw it as sort of a gangster familial grab who wanted to build their golf courses all over Europe. Anyhow, I couldn't resist that. Some notes on the intellectual world that led up to Luther. And I do want to spend a little time with this, but I want to race on. I realize I'm running behind a little bit. In England, a man named John Wycliffe, who lived in the 14th century, you see his dates there, 1328 to 1384, founded a group that became known as Lollards. He's an academic, he's a priest, and he was, after his death, declared a heretic. His principles that he preached and that his followers preached were like a textbook model for positions that Luther is going to argue for in the 1520s. some 150 years later. Wealth has decayed the church. The clergy should live in poverty. The entire church hierarchy should submit to temporal state authority. We shouldn't have this pope who's both a prince and a religious leader. The authority of Scripture outweighs church tradition. Just because popes have told us stuff is not as important as the word of the Bible. The institution of the papacy itself is not justified by Scripture. The Bible should be translated into vernacular languages. In England, that means English. In Germany, that would be German. There was a belief in the doctrine of the elect, or what we will see is later called predestination, and we'll see the implications of that. And there are attacks on the veneration of the saints, which Wycliffe regarded as idolatrous, on sacraments themselves, and particularly on transubstantiation, which is the principle behind the church's sacrament of the Eucharist, that argues that the substances of bread and wine are actually changed into the body and blood of Jesus Christ within the context of the Mass. And the argument that Wycliffe wants to make is that these are unscriptural. They're not founded in Scripture. You can't point to them. And that the priesthood of every Christian should be recognized. You shouldn't just have this separate class distinction. Again, this is textbook Luther. Why doesn't it get embraced? Because it was not in the place and time that had the social political underpinnings that Luther will have in that fragmented Holy Roman Empire. And we'll be talking about this next time, in the next session. That, yes, the Lutheran critique is on the board. One would argue that Francis of Assisi, a couple of centuries before this, would have no trouble with almost the entire agenda here, except the time is not yet ripe. Jan Hus in Prague, a Czech Bohemian academic, declared a heretic and burned at the stake by the Council of Constance at the same point in time that they declare Wycliffe a heretic. He's strongly influenced by Wycliffe. He introduces, he adopts all of the same positions. He introduces a kind of nationalistic element into the religious struggle, that in the sense that we Czechs we Bohemians here, deserve to have our own control of our own church. No, Huss's dates really are 1415. Oh, I see what you're saying. It's 1372. I take it back. Thank you for the catch. I have his birthday. Somebody noticed that he can't be minus 57 years old. Thank you, Jeff. So his birthday would have been 1372 to 1450 when he's burned at the stake. And he also attacks the sale of indulgences, introduces what Luther will take as a central theme. So by 1500, the major themes raised by Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation had been voiced, and there was an articulated worldview waiting for its historical moment. And which is the way history often works. Often people often give the credit to the person who mouths the new position at the right point in time. But usually what's happened is that the position was there all along, mouthed all along, and it's just that the underlying social economic conditions just had to become ripe for it to find its voice. That said, so in the 14th and 15th centuries, and it's a point that I want to make leading into our period, there is a kind of a spiritual renaissance that takes place. An expanding class of lay people, non-church people, were literate and had access to religious culture. Certainly after the printing press develops, there was widespread resentment of the control of a decadent and often undereducated clergy. The Black Death had tremendous apocalyptic and millennialist triggers for anxiety. If you can imagine, if you see the way the nutballs are coming out of the woodwork in the era of COVID, can you imagine if 1 out of 3 people in town was dropping dead and we had the firing up of corpses in the street? What that would do to millennialism? Everybody thought that the end days were upon us, and repent now was the issue of the day. So there is an explosion of devotional literature by 1500. And the printing press allows it to go all over the place. So Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ, for instance, gets thousands and thousands of copies, get printed and disseminated in different languages. And in its own way, Renaissance humanism, which I talked about in the last class, had with its strong focus on self-development and the cultivation of a rich interior sensibility, in its own way led to religious self-appraisal, self-development often. In Northern Europe in particular, the Renaissance finds expression in the Renaissance humanism of Northern Europe finds its expression in a much more religious context than it does in Italy. And I use this crucifixion by Matthias Grunewald as a model. Very, very pietistic in its sensibility. A decidedly more intense religious tone than you'd find in the art of Italy in the same period, and with also the same humanist roots. And to that point, I want to point out, I'm going to use the artwork of the Hubert and Jan van Eyck, in particular Jan van Eyck, the brother, and a series of slides. I want to point out how a great humanist painter, early humanist painter, can turn to mystical and religious themes in a way that you would not have found so usual in Italian rendition. So this is an element, one of the several panels of the Ghent altarpiece in St. Bavo's Cathedral. And here's this symbolic, the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, sacrificing its blood, surrounded by angels who are very human in aspect. But it's just one of the several panels. If we go to the next slide, this is the full tilt. This is the whole of the interior panels. And it's a staggering work. As I was constructing, I was telling a friend that as I was constructing imagery for this session of the course, I realized I had now, when we can get past this, and I feel like I can take a plane again, that Ghent is now on the tour. It's a place I've never been to, and I'd love to see this thing. Glory, if you can imagine. I can cheat a little bit. zoom us in, you can see, for instance, the fuller rendition of sort of the entire church. I just showed you the Lamb with the angels, but we have fathers of the church, and we have all kinds of allegorical elements in and the old aristocracy and church people, and not to mention Adam and Eve. And let me come down to regular size. We have Mary and the Baptist. Here I give you some zoom on this screen. So you have, if you will, Gothic religiosity meeting Renaissance humanism. Angels in the choir as unidealized individuals. And by the way, I actually came across some academic monograph in which a musicologist was arguing that he or she, I don't know who wrote it, could determine from the choir of angels in the Ghent altarpiece what voice range each of the angels was singing in, from the way the mouth was held. Who were the bassos and who were the tenors and who were the altos, and more power to them if they can do that. It's also, by the way, this altarpiece was restored relatively recently, within the last couple of years. Maybe that's why I had never seen great images of it until relatively recently. And a number of people have become quite disturbed that the mystical lamb has human eyes. And this has been pointed out in lots of places, and people are trying to figure out what it means. And a number of people have become incredibly unnerved by this. The Almighty over here is surrounded, his panel, there are Latin inscriptions: life without death on his head, youth without age on his forehead, joy without sorrow on his right side, safety without fear on his left side. And God knows what the iconography, every element of this iconography. I imagine there are art historians who go on about this piece for like entire books. I was particularly taken with this Northern European depiction of Adam and Eve. So human on one hand, and so unlike human representation as would have been done by the Italians. If you can remember sort of the idealized body imagery that we were looking at in a number of the art pieces that we focus on in that last class, for I know many of you were in that. Anybody who wasn't in that, who is in this one, by the way, they're all still up online on YouTube, and you can go hear those lectures at some point. But the non-idealized muscularity of the bodies, these are guys you probably could have met down at the Ghent marketplace, I'm sure, if you went down there on a Tuesday morning. Anyhow, and a final comment on Jan van Eyck. This idea of that, and we'll see it stretching through the other lectures. A lot of the Reformation figures, the artists were, and the non-artists, the intellectuals, were humanists. They were educated in the same humanist tradition as the Italian humanists that we looked at in that last class. But they tend to, well, they introduce some of the same thematic elements. So point A, the portrait, the self-portrait of Van Eyck is very much as the Italians would have done it with those. In fact, doesn't he look like that painting of the Italian Doge that we used in that last session? The penetrating eyes, the self-regard, the painter looking straight at you and straight through you as you look at him and engages you in this examination of self. And then the humanist using the flattering of the patron that you would have found like in the ducal portraits of the Montefeltro family in Italy. You have Van Eyck in the north idealizing, in the famous Arnolfini portrait, the new merchant class. So he's in a world less dominated by the total control of aristocrats, in which the new moneyed class are the ones who will pay the bills. And I'm sure that's why the Ghent has such a richly elaborated altarpiece. They could, I'm sure the town fathers all kicked in big time for that. And here you have Mr. and Mrs. newly emergent capitalist banking family in this gorgeous photo, which even includes, if I can zoom in further, their reflection back here in this wonderful, wonderful painting that is whoops, sorry about that. Oh, I've gotten ahead of myself. That is decidedly humanistic, and decidedly northern in sensibility. So with that, we have about 10 minutes, and I am going to share. And we are back, and I am going to do a combination. I've taken everybody off mute. And if somebody wants to either chat, question, or a comment, make a comment. Be my guest. But for people who were in the last class, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. I wonder if you see it that way. I'll take that as a yes.
It's
yeah. It's like
typical college classroom.
Right, where I can't pull you out the way we do it in normal. The next few sessions are going to be, I think, much different in tone in that we focus on the concrete elements of the period. Next time we're going to be talking about Luther a lot and Calvin a lot and exactly what the argument with the church is.
great.
And in the Counter-Reformation class and in the fourth session class, there will be much more consideration of different aspects of the art and architecture of the period. I had to get all of our maps and trade routes and what have you displayed in this round, just to make sure that we had a ballpark of the background in our heads.
I
thought it was interesting that they said the papacy or the religious were corrupt, and that they weren't going to look to them as the origins of truth, or
Yeah, or the moral authorities, or
right.
exactly. Now, remember, there are also things like religious orders around that have truly devoted people in them. I mean, everything there was on the map, but the hierarchy, especially the hierarchy, was almost uniformly resented, and that was probably true even inside the church at the time.
Lou,
But
I
there-
have a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, please,
Oh.
Renee.
I just wondered how you said part of it, but I think of the way people think of the Pope, and he goes by. There's those who are religious, there's such devotion to the Pope as a person and a representative of God and Jesus.
And you think of that now, you mean?
Yes, there
And
doesn't seem like there was any of that feeling at that time, or I'm asking the question, really.
yeah, I would say that was fairly accurate.
Hi there. Doing good,
I-
thanks.
Yeah, I would say that I would suggest that at the time, a lot of peasant populations still had a kind of magical relationship with religion, and that sacramentality, cults of the saints, the touching of blessed objects and things like that. The more what I'll refer to as, and Luther might have referred to also, as the more pagan elements of Christianity had a strong hold on a lot of the peasant class. And I'm not so sure to what degree they were looking for moral leadership, but they were looking for the magic of the king, the magic of the ducal lord, the magic of. Did you ever see people crawling up their knees to kiss the foot of a statue?
Oh, in Mexico, I saw them crying.
Exactly, or in churches just all over the world, or people venerating a relic, and that aspect of Christianity is what most disturbed Wycliffe and Hus and some of the reformers. And indeed, one would argue that in the Counter-Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church itself begins to address a lot of that and begins to say, well, you're right, it is a little bit over the top. But I got to tell you, though, that when my grandmother would take me for a walk in Newark from her house to the poultry store on South Orange Avenue, we had to pass the front porch of a woman who had a little shrine to the Virgin out in front, and my grandmother made me genuflect and make the sign of the cross. So Southern Italian immigrants of 60 years ago were not far removed from elements of that kind of magical thinking. Or maybe I'm doing my grandmother an injustice.
No, I agree.
Rose, give me a break wherever you are. Anyhow,
Gunpowder really was the great equalizer. When you think that a knight who spent his entire life honing his abilities and had a retinue of armor on him that probably cost more than what a small village could produce in terms of income for a year.
That's right.
Suddenly, you have a peasant with virtually no training, but you put an arquebus in his hands and you could take him down. That must have, what a quantum shift that was in terms of the power play.
That was a quantum shift. That was a quantum shift. And of course, it was both good news and bad news in the sense that it produced an arms race of a scale that we still haven't gotten past. It meant that you could create spectacularly large armies relatively on the cheap. And then it got not so cheap because it had to get bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, until you wound up with Spanish armadas and things of that ilk.
You had weapons in the past that could take someone down, like, say, the Welsh longbow, the English longbow, but it took a whole lifetime to develop the
Sure.
skill to use something like that.
Sure.
Now you just had guys, all you had to do was push a trigger and boom.
Sure. And indeed, when cannon was first introduced in the late 15th century to the West, in the late 15th century, you needed very skilled keepers of the equipment who knew how to use it until technology just kept improving to the point that certainly by the early 17th century, you could train somebody to be in an artillery unit in probably a couple of weeks. They did not have to know much about tempering the metal and all that kind of thing. Anyhow,
Question.
Can I,
How much did spread of education, you know, through the printing press, through development of eyeglasses so that the common person could afford something to read with, you know, attribute, you know, a lot of the thinking to change. A lot of it was a scientific change that was happening. There was more questioning going on.
that's gonna be that is really going to be a feature of the mid to later part of our period. In other words, in fact, you know, in the last session, I needed a poster child for, and you'll see why when we get there, for a successful Protestant-controlled state that was heavily capitalist and Republican, if you will, you know, without a powerfully controlling prince. And I settle on Holland in its golden age, also because it's got a tremendous art golden age that we can take a peek at along the way. But they became the center for both lens grinding for all of Europe, both for eyeglasses and for telescopes and microscopes and the development of science, and they became the center of printing. So all that stuff that the English and the French bourgeoisies were passing around when stuff was printed was usually censored in their own countries. And they would go to Leiden or Rotterdam or Amsterdam or Antwerp to have printed. And so Holland became this central focal point for the dissemination of text. And it had a tremendous impact. But early in our period, Luther being able to just get the New Testament and then the Old Testament into German, and a very common, I was going to say Plattdeutsch. It is a Low German, but it's fairly a grammatical German as well. When he gets that document produced, suddenly you have the first tool for lower income people to start learning how to read from. And it's because there's nothing like learning how to read from a text that you already know by heart. So you heard the Sermon on the Mount 1,000 times, and now you could have it in text and learn how to follow along as you went. Anyhow, a question, Ed.
You know, the Ottoman Empire always fascinated me. I mean, how they were able to spread across Europe, bring their influence. And I just cannot understand how a country, Turkey, as small as it was able to do this expansion, go into Europe in different parts, and got almost, I think they got to Austria, or if they didn't, they were close to it.
They got to within 10 miles of Vienna.
Right.
They
But it
besieged
was-
it twice.
Yeah, and it's amazing how they were able to do that. I mean, are
But
there
you
any
have-
good books?
Yeah. Oh, there are many. There are many. But you have to remember that part of the world, first in as the Greek Roman Empire, was used to having local control for local issues with an emperor far, far away, who often spoke a different language. In the Roman world, that was certainly true. And then subsequently, as the Greek Byzantine Empire, and then as the Islamic Empire, that you had a world that was very used to, whether you were in Egypt or Syria or in Turkey or in Bulgaria, being given great amounts of local control as long as you paid your taxes and contributed to the overall military support of whoever the big kahuna happened to be, whether it was a Greek emperor or whether it was a caliph in Baghdad, or whether it was a sultan in Istanbul. It didn't matter. You could keep your local language. There were people speaking Greek in Islamic parts of the world right into the 18th century, simply because that's the language they always spoken locally in that part of the world. There are people speaking versions of Syriac all over the Arabic world. Arabic may have become the dominant ruling language, but it wasn't enforced everywhere. This is by way of saying that the Ottomans had a model in place that they learned very much from. That you, as the new big people on the block, can have tremendous amounts of military control and imperial centralized control, and still while allowing your the allegiance of the smaller states to have a certain amount of ethnic diversity, religious diversity, linguistic diversity, and to still control their fate to some degree. Anyhow, there are a lot of books. So next time,